this poll and switch screens and make you presenter. Everyone, enjoy your awesome webinar.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Strate. We're here for the next session in our data lifecycle optimization series, architecture and availability. So we're going to be covering two of the pillars of our approach that Pragmatic Works has in today's session. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jason Strate. I'm Solutions Architect here with Pragmatic Works. Been working with SQL Server for 17-something years, long enough that I really just don't bother to count anymore. And I've probably been saying it's been 17 years for a couple of years now. Been around, played around with SQL Server in all sorts of different capacities, everywhere from a data warehouse developer when I first started out, even though I didn't know what a data warehouse was, to a DBA, and now back to doing architecture work on both data warehouses and transactional systems. So what we're talking about today is architecture and availability. And it's really that idea that you have to have a sound foundation for your platform to get what you need out of it. If you don't take the time, it doesn't matter what you put into it, you're just not going to get the results that you're expecting. And that's kind of what we're talking about. And a lot of times when I'm talking with organizations and we're talking about where they are within the life cycle of their data platform, they start talking about how they've organically grown. And organically grown over time into what sometimes becomes kind of a mess. And the idea that we want to get to, and the things that we're going to talk about today, is how do you go from growing organically and having kind of a mess of the architecture to smoothing that out so that you can really get through and have the platform that you want and the platform that you need. And the way that we do our approach, and this is what we talked a lot about on Monday, and I'm just going to do a brief intro here so that you guys know what we're talking about, is the idea of data lifecycle optimization. It's the process that we use here at Pragmatic Works to look at platforms. And it's basically the idea of starting off with architecture and configuration, which is half of what we're going to be talking about today, and then moving into availability and continuity. There's a number of other phases to the process, but we're going to be just focusing today on these first two. And with these first two, we want to be able to take a look and see, where is it that we're going to go when we're building out our environment, and what are the things that you need to be thinking about. Now, when you're talking about architecture and configuration, there is the need to make sure that this isn't just for DBAs. There's a lot of times where I'll get into architecture discussions and availability discussions especially, and the main focus becomes just the transactional platform. It's not just for the data, the DBAs and the transactional platform. It needs to also be for the entire data platform. We need to stop thinking about data as transactional or data warehousing and think of it as an asset that the company has in various forms. The data that comes out of your transactional system may not be what's driving the immediate business, but it's probably going to be what's going to be driving the future business. So what we need to start thinking about it is everything from a data platform professional. And so if you are working with data, you do need to have a solid foundation for your architecture and the ability to always get back into the data that you have and have that availability on the platform. And so the two things that we're talking about here today are going to be architecture and configuration. So we'll start off with architecture and then we'll get into the availability and continuity. If you have questions throughout, please put them into the Q&A. When we get to the end, I'll go through all the questions that we have time for. I'm hoping to leave a bit of time at the end for questions because I'm expecting as we talk through this that it'll generate some thoughts that you guys want to share or have questions answered. Anything that I don't get to, I'll cover with a blog post following this presentation so you can get those answers. When it comes to architecture and configuration, though, there is kind of just some first things that you need to think about when you're looking at that. When you're building it out and you want to have that platform, you really need to understand what those needs of the platform are. What is it that you're planning to do? And you want to make sure that you're planning ahead, because the time that it takes to go back and re-engineer always takes longer than if you would have just planned for it ahead of time. Always make sure that you're involving those data consumers in the design, and then build out a logical architecture and get that architecture validated. One of the things that I see quite often is, you'll get a great design and it'll look great and you'll work through it and you've spent all the time, and I've done this myself, where I get the whole thing put together and then I get someone else to take a look at it, and I've been laughed at. Actually, I used to have a DBA that I worked with back when I first started out as a data warehouse housing professional, that every single time I brought him a design or a recommendation for architecture, he would just say no. Now, he said no with a purpose. The idea that he wanted me to validate my decisions, validate and go through, because before we implement that physical design, which is the last step of architecture, is to make sure that it was exactly what I was looking for. You need to be very intentional with your architecture and not be reactive, because when you are reactive, you end up having to make a lot of what's the word here? You're going to have to make a lot of trade-offs, and trade-offs that you wouldn't typically have made if you were planning from ahead of time. And the interesting thing about what's been happening in the last few years, and what makes this idea of being intentional even more attractive, is that what we can do with our platforms and what we can build out has really changed. In the last couple of years, cloud technologies have become mainstream. Now, they may not be something that you're currently using in your environment. There's a lot of companies that are still acclimating to the idea of doing any sort of offsite or cloud-based deployments, but if you start to look at what's happened because of that, our environments have really turned into this Lego land of capabilities, where you can just pick and choose the different capacities and components to build out your platform. And this applies to both on-premise appliances and then the cloud, because of